Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, this is Callistophilus, and it is my utmost delight to welcome you to the world of Severance, Blade of Darkness. Severance, Blade of Darkness. Blade, the Age of Darkness for our viewers from Spain, or simply Blade of Darkness for the US citizens, is an action-adventure game developed by Rebel Act Studios and published by Codemasters. It was released back in February 2001 and was exclusive to the PC platform. This game is special, and there aren't really that many like it. Probably the closest relative to it, gameplay-wise, could be considered the Souls series of games, but the difficulty cannot really be compared due to the free save game mechanics of Severance. But where do I even start with this one? It is not like I haven't anything to say about this game, quite the opposite in fact. There's just so much to talk about that I find it difficult to meaningfully formulate all the topics into a reasonable story to tell. But okay, let's start with the overall summary of the game. So, Blade of Darkness is a third-person action-adventure game where you assume the role of one of 4 characters of your choosing. You get to pick between Knight Sargon, Naglfar the Dwarf, adventuress named Zoe, and Tukaram the Barbarian, each having different stats, weapon specializations, attacks, and combos. Especially this weapon specialization plays a huge role in the replayability of the game, as you won't be able to use most of the weapons you find in a single playthrough. Well, you can wield them, but if your chosen character isn't specialized in that specific type of weapon, then he or she will be extremely clumsy with it, and you'd be better off avoiding these weapons altogether, even though their stats might be better than the ones you already have. Speaking of specializations, the Knight is proficient in one-handed swords and shields, the Dwarf with one-handed axes and shields, adventuress knows how to use spears, and the barbarian can wield two-handed swords and axes. Besides having different weapons and playstyles, each character also gets their own personal introductory levels, which eases them into the overarching storyline, which is shared between all 4 characters. The story itself is a mixed bag of sorts. There really isn't that much to spoil here, as everything is laid out before you in a very straightforward fashion without any real plot twists. There is evil that has been released onto the world, and it is said that only a hero wielding a godly weapon called the Sword of Yana is able to stop it. That sword, however, is extremely difficult to find, and only the Chosen One, who has gathered all of the 6 holy runes, may wield its 2 powers of light in order to combat the darkness. The story goes deeper than that, but that is a very generalized description of what's happening. I would say that the story takes a bit of a backseat as your generic fantasy tale, but when you hear the narrator telling you all the intricacies of it, it sounds absolutely epic.
Crossing mountains and steppes, jungles and deserts, you shall reach a secret valley where a large river runs. Close to its bank there is a temple. Only the chosen ones shall find it. When Ayana cast her spell to expel the gods from the earth, she wanted to save her temple from desecration, so she used magic spells to conceal it from view. Now you are in Ayana's favor. Perhaps you shall be her chosen one and prove worthy to take up the sword.
The voice work of the narrator is simply one of a kind, and along with very memorable music backing it up, the game's presentation of the story gets elevated to greater heights than it has any real right to be. What I'm trying to say is that the game presents the story in a very good fashion, which makes you forget that the overall story itself is in all reality quite bland. Also, when you play the game and try to follow the story, you will quite often hear references to kingdoms, people, or events, which are never really mentioned again. This gives off a vibe of deep history behind the events of the game, but without any real context, a way to learn more, or even having multiple references to the same events in the game, they come off as a bit shallow once you notice it. But enough about that. All in all, the game's story is not a masterpiece, but it tries its best to hide its generic part of the fantasy tale from the player. I have played Severance before and have completed it once with the Knight probably over 10 years ago now. I have also played a bit with the adventurers and the dwarves, so for this playthrough I have chosen to go with the barbarian, as he would be the one I don't really have any prior experience with, and what a better way to revisit an old classic than from a fresh page with a clear mindset. The game does have a tutorial level which teaches you the basics of the game, its adventure mechanics and the combat system. One thing that is shown here is the fact that there are these specific reinforced boxes which can be destroyed only by setting them ablaze with a light source like a torch. Too bad that this idea only appears in the tutorial level, as I don't really recall any occasions during my playthrough where this was actually used, and that's a shame, as it looks like a really good way to add a bit of more dynamic to the gameplay. And as we run through the tutorial level, it starts. The crashing. We need to have a talk about how to get this game running on a modern system and what I had to go through so you'd understand my deep frustration with this game on a technical level. And don't worry, I will reveal to you the definitive way to get it running on a modern system later in this video. If you're really anxious about it, there is a time code for that in the description box below, but now back to the crashing. This game is an absolute bitch to get running properly without it looking like a potato, stuttering in places like it's having a seizure, or flat out crashing in specific places. It came out during the Wild West era of graphics APIs, so it tries to support OpenGL, DirectX, and 3dFX through multiple Voodoo card variants. Running it today on a Windows 10 PC is a challenge, but not because it wouldn't start or load the textures in properly, but because it starts crashing like crazy in pretty much every setting you try to run it in. I ended up trying to go with the OpenGL renderer, yes, even the newer patched up one, as it seemed to be the most stable one of the bunch. That however meant that I had to use OBS to record the footage you're seeing right now. Although it seemed to have worked, now I found a new issue, which is that the game refuses to load in any levels whilst OBS is running in the background. So I have to start the game, then start OBS, then start recording, and then play the game, which is exactly as tedious as it sounds, but I'll take it. At least after a level has loaded in, saving and loading the game works just fine and doesn't crash the game. Until you reach the end of the level, where it crashes again and you have to stop OBS from recording, making it impossible to get a recording of the level selection screen and its amazing narration. Oh, and also, the basic enemy's portrait is missing for whatever reason in OpenGL mode. No biggie though, as all the other enemies seem to show up just fine. After spending way more time than I'd like to admit on getting this game to run in a more acceptable fashion, I found the following compromise. Using the R3DFX renderer with Nglide gives me the ability to use Radeon image sharpening for some subjectively better graphics and use Relive for recording gameplay. The performance, however, is far from perfect, and thus I decided to also add in DXVK to the mix, after which the game is now running at 120 FPS near constantly. Yes, using DXVK in Windows for older games is definitely a thing now, and the results are pretty amazing. The only real downside to this method is that some parts of the game are still bugged out, like the tutorial mission and Amazon's starting level, where the game would simply crash, and you'd have to use another renderer in order to skip those crashing sequences. It's a mess, and with all honesty, it's not an enjoyable experience. So there's gotta be a better way. Right? Right? And then, after spending more than a week trying to come up with a solution for this mess, it hit me, completely by random, and I could not believe my eyes when I saw it. You can run this game using 3dFX mode and not have the game crash on you with a simple workaround. Alt-tabbing. Yes, every time there is a loading screen presented in the game, when you Alt-tab out of the game during the loading sequence and then Alt-tab right back in, the loading will always be successful. This is probably one of the most awkward and random fixes that I've come across in the past 20 years, so I added it also to the PC Gaming Wiki's article on Severance. Needless to say, this game was an absolute nightmare to figure out, but now it can be enjoyed properly on modern systems and we can finally start talking about the game itself. Alas, before we get to that, I would also like to note that under Linux, Severance is actually pretty easy to get running. The handy lootery script seems to do most of the deploying for you, and if you're okay with the quality, you can simply just jump in and start playing. Do note though that the same issues haunt the game running through Wine as they did on the Windows version. So you probably also noticed that the game runs in 4:3 aspect ratio, as back in the day, the widescreen resolutions weren't really a thing yet. And when you try to force the game to use a 16:9 resolution, then the image would simply look stretched and unnatural. Another thing to note here is that the game engine does not support any resolutions higher than 1920 by 1080 or Full HD and will simply crash should you attempt to run it in one. Because of this, for my playthrough, I stuck with 1024 by 786 at 120Hz resolution set internally by the game for the 3dFX renderer, and using Glide I managed to upscale it to 2048 by 1536 at 120Hz. Now that's a resolution you don't get to see every day, but I'm glad to report that the game plays just buttery smooth with these settings and is very enjoyable. One problem that I did note very early on whilst trying to play the game on the 48-inch LG C1 OLED display was that the FOV for the game is not really changeable and everything looks just a bit too close or zoomed in for a comfortable gaming session. Luckily, the game does have 4 different camera modes to choose from, and the most distant from the character works like a charm in order to compensate for looking at this huge display from that close up. Unfortunately, the camera mode resets every time you load the game, but the fix is simply a button press away, so I'm not really complaining here, just informing you of my experience with this kind of setup. Finally, we're through with the setup section, and it does feel like we've been talking about this game for ages now. Anyways, let's talk about the bread and butter of this game as we go through the first couple of levels, or episodes as I like to call them, the combat. The combat in Severance is deep, fast and ruthless, just like a one-night stand. Small mistakes you make can prove to be very expensive as the enemies hit fast and they hit hard. I really like this balance of powers as your character is deadly against the enemies, but so are they against your character. This game is definitely not trying to give you a power trip, but much rather would like to test your skills and have you earn your progress through the story. Having played other characters before, the Barbarian feels a bit naked in regards to defense. Both the Knight and the Dwarf rely on shields to give you some breathing room for thinking your next moves through, and even Zoe the Adventuress has longer reaching weapons, so playing as the Barbarian, it feels like you really need to get up close and personal with the enemies. Luckily, he also has the most amount of health out of all the playable characters and some pretty sick moves, so it offsets the difficulty quite nicely. Speaking of which, this game does not have a difficulty selection, rather it ranks your bravery by counting the amount of saves you have made throughout your playthrough. I remembered the Blade of Darkness as a pretty difficult game to overcome, but after going through it this time around, I must reconsider. At least with the Barbarian, once you get proper weapons and know which moves work best against which enemies, the game becomes much easier and not that big of a challenge. The initial journey there, though, is a masterpiece of difficulties design, but back to combat. It is excellent. As I was saying, the combat and everything around it is excellent. You get a ton of moves and special combos for each type of weapon, and every weapon also has a special attack or two in some cases. Some enemies also carry keys and potions around with them, so prioritizing bursting down the enemies with potions is a must, as they will either drop it when they die, or they can drink it themselves mid-fight if you give them enough breathing room. It is a really nice touch to the combat gameplay and adds a variety to your combat priorities. Speaking of combat priorities, jibbing and mutilation of enemy corpses is definitely a thing in this game. Probably most of the time when you finish off an enemy, they will end up losing a limb or two. This is nice and all, but why stop there when you can hack the corpses up even further and then use the hacked off limbs as weapons? It is pretty much as useless as it sounds, but a very nice touch to the game, which definitely makes it memorable. And as we are talking about doing some damage already, it's also nice to see that as your health drops, there are actual wounds on your character which show up, increasing the immersion of the game. And again, a nice little touch. What is also nice? No. Absolutely bloody amazing, I should say, is the narrator. By the holy rod of epic stiffness, this guy could probably read the story of Little Red Riding Hood and make it sound like a scene from The Lord of the Rings.
Treachery and perfidy have reached as far as the icy fortress, and its inhabitants have fallen under the dominion of a powerful demon and lost their reason. But Burr, the White Gem, has been saved, and mounted in ice, it retains all its purity.
Although the story, as covered before, is a bit generic, this narrator absolutely nails his performance and does his very best to bring the game's lore alive for the player. The general audio work regarding sound effects and music is also pretty amazing for its time. Some sounds can glitch out from time to time, but the overall experience is really good. And the music has a few very memorable tunes and some great ambient tracks which elevate the immersion of the game. What's also really cool in Severance is the level design. The levels you encounter are for the most part like tiny hubs which loop in on themselves one way or another. You almost never get the feeling that you're simply walking through corridor after corridor being guided through the story sections, but rather you're welcomed by the feeling of relief of coming up to a familiar location from a different angle after a long struggle through the remote sections, if that makes any sense. The only real exception to this is probably the last level, where it is more of a guided experience to the boss fight, but by that time you really don't mind the old level out in the grand scheme of things. So the first couple of levels are pretty much the most challenging for the game when it comes to playing as the Barbarian. You aren't really that strong, and you haven't unlocked any of the useful weapon combos yet. During these sections, every time you level up is like a Christmas morning where you immediately check your moves roster for new combos and skills to try out. Enemies are deadly, and you need to be rather careful with your moves so you wouldn't die too soon into this story. Every time you level up, you also get all your lost health back, so sometimes it can be beneficial to keep an eye on your experience bar to know how big of a risk you can take during your next combat encounter. In the first couple of levels, you should also notice that there are some runes hidden away in some of the levels. 6 runes in 6 different levels in total. They are used during the endgame to power up the legendary Sword of Yana and allow you to use its special attacks. These runes are not mandatory to be collected. However, I would very strongly urge you to try and get them all, because the very last boss fight in the game requires you to have all the runes connected and the sword fully powered up. If you don't have them, you will not be able to get to the final boss fight and you will not get the proper ending to the game. Should you miss out on a rune in a level though, it's not the end of the world either. Once you acquire the Sword of Yana, you will be allowed to revisit the levels where you have missed the secret runes. Downsides to revisiting them is though that these levels are now populated with the worst of the worst enemies in the game. En masse. And sometimes it's just easier to simply run past most of them than fight. But with that being said, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. By level 6 as a Barbarian, I acquired the AA axe, and that was kind of a turning point for me in the game. It got a whole lot easier from this point onwards, mainly due to the weapon being able to absolutely decimate the orcs, which have been rather tedious to deal with so far. Level 7 and 8 were simply enjoyable. I could simply keep on spinning with the axe until everyone in the room was dead and proceed. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit here. It wasn't that straightforward and the difficulty was actually pretty good. I never got stuck due to a tough fight, but didn't exactly mow through the enemies as well because of one false move, and the blades which the enemies wield in this game are deadly. During the 9th level in the game, you could actually see other playable characters in a short cutscene, which is a really nice touch by the developers. When I last played Severance as a knight, I did see Zoe the Adventuress there, if my mind ain't playing tricks on me. I also found the Doom Axe during this level and, well, that's pretty much the very best weapon for the Barbarian in the whole game. Even though I couldn't use its special attack yet, the regular damage that this axe dishes out is just ridiculous. By the time I reached level 10, I also had access to its special attack, which is pretty good against the Dark Knights. So all in all, the game's deep combat system just became overly simplified with this one weapon. Use the special attack against the Dark Knights and mow everyone else down with a quick attack combo. At around that time, I also started noticing the fact that I had been wasting potions simply to make sure that I don't leave any lying on the ground. The issue with potions is that they really heal for so little besides the full health potion, that they're pretty much useless for the barbarian, who by this time already has a huge health pool to draw from. Sure, there are moments when you will use the potions to clutch through some of the tougher situations, but for the majority of my playthrough I simply kept the stockpile full and only drank once I had to pick up another potion. Level 11 also has a specific location here which tends to, well, crash out, which is unfortunate. You can make it past this section by not looking at something, don't know exactly what, but if you look away from the center of the room, then the crash is not that frequent here. Also, there is a very intimidating boss fight situation going on at the very end of this level. When I finally arrived at Iana's temple and got the sword from the altar, that's where I noticed that I had missed out on one of the runes from Oasis of Negeb. Revisiting that level was initially not a very pleasant experience, but I quickly learned that the enemy placement is very much localized when revisiting locations. This means that the enemies which spawn in to kill you are pretty much compartmentalized into bite-sized arenas and don't really follow you around once you leave those imaginary areas. Hence, finding them is pretty much a waste of time, your nerves and resources. Some of them you will have to fight, but most of them can simply be bypassed quite easily. So after I got all the runes together, it was time to meet and greet the big bad wolf of the game and head towards the final couple of levels of the game. By the time I got the final shock sword for the barbarian, I didn't really know what to do with it. I mean, the Doom Axe has way better combos, and the special attack for the shock sword, well, it's just tedious to get right. So I simply used the Doom Axe for combat and the special attacks for the sword of Iana whenever applicable. But let's talk about the special attack of Iana's sword. It makes the final levels of the game a breeze to go through. Its special attack does cost quite a bit of stamina, but launches a powerful line projectile, which deals a ton of damage and passes through enemies. As most of the enemies in this game are slow melee combatants, you might see the problem here. You can pretty much just cheese one special attack for the rest of the game and kill every opponent with it without ever having to resort to melee again. Small cannon fodder enemies? Not a problem. Big bad golems and other beings? Also not a problem. It is tedious in some encounters, but definitely doable. I used this special attack whenever applicable for larger enemies, but mainly still used the Axe of Doom as it was just way more fun to use. And with these thoughts, honestly, there's nothing more I could say about the combat. The rest of the game is a breeze, including the remaining boss fights and the final confrontation with the big bad Necrowolf. One thing to note though, which I did notice throughout my playthrough, was that the Barbarian only had a single armor upgrade, whereas the Knight got 3. I'm not complaining as the Barbarian already has a huge health pool, but it would have been nice to get additional armor pieces for the Barbarian as well, in order to change up the looks of the character from time to time. By this point, you might get a feeling that I really like this game. And you'd be absolutely correct. It's an absolute gem of a game, and it should have received way more attention back in the day than it did. Reading about it on the wiki today reveals that the reception of the game was really good back in the day, but it failed to gain traction due to poor marketing and difficult gameplay. I cannot say that I know anything about its marketing, which was done at that time, but what I can say is that back then the game was indeed a bit difficult for me. But not to a degree which I wasn't able to overcome with really nice, rewarding practice. Looking at it today, I find the difficulty to be really well balanced, all things considered, and the game itself plays like a charm. Although multiple playthroughs of a single game are really not my thing, I love revisiting these old classics, and I must say that having played through this game with the Barbarian did feel like a fresh experience. Though it has been over 10 years now since the last time I played it, so... anyways... Where can you get Blade of Darkness today and how much will it cost you? Well, the good news is that if you purchased the game ages ago on GOG.com, then you probably still have it in your library and are bored by this section of the video. If you did not, however, then the bad news is that the game is also in a licensing limbo and no one seems to be absolutely certain who holds the actual rights to the intellectual property. Hence, it is not available on any online or offline storefronts. Luckily, the second-hand market is full of this game as by the time of making this video, and a boxed copy should set you back roughly around 5 to 10 euros without the shipping. In addition to that, the game is also listed on a few abandonware sites, so you could grab it for free as well, although I don't know exactly how legal it is to have it up there. And in case you're still wondering, then yes, I wholeheartedly recommend getting this game whenever you get a chance, as it is a one-of-a-kind masterpiece of its time, both visually and gameplay-wise. And now, as a bonus, here's how to get it running properly under Windows 10 with buttery smooth FPS and 3D-FX rendering through nGlide and DXVK. First of all, get the game. Install it and have it patched up to version 1.01, which is the latest official version available. Next, if you have the GOG version, then use the nGlide configurator found in the bin folder of the game installation and set up your actual resolution to which the game will be upscaled to. If you have another version of the game which does not come with nGlide pre-packaged, then simply download nGlide from its official website, install it and configure it globally. Don't worry about adding any additional files to the game's directory for nGlide to work, it does its magic globally, so after configure it, you should simply be good to go. Now, if we were to run the game at this point using the 3DFX mode, then it would work, but the performance would be very unstable, especially near light sources like torches or when looking at the sun. In order to fix that, we shall use DXVK, which is essentially a DirectX to Vulkan translation layer developed for gaming on Linux. Simply download its latest release, unpack it and grab the contents of its x32 folder and dump them in Severance's bin folder where the blade.exe can be found. Don't worry about googling DXVK and nGlide. I will leave the direct links in the description box below for quick access. But after you're done with that, you're pretty much good to go. Launch blade.exe, enter setup, set R3DFX Voodoo 1 to 2 as your video renderer and select configure. For the internal resolution, just go with the highest you see fit and run the game. Should the game crash before getting to the main menu, I would recommend renaming or removing the intro video file found in the game's installation folder /data/video/EnglishUS. You can easily just watch it with any old media player and then do away with it, as it tends to cause more problems than what it's worth. Alas, after all this, you are good to go. If I enable the Afterburner overlay, you can see that I'm easily able to run the game at 120 FPS with proper graphics and no slowdowns near light sources. The easiest way to test this has always been the tutorial level, where you can simply look up in the sky for the sun right in the beginning. But I sincerely hope that this video has been entertaining for you, or has spiked an interest in this game, as it is truly a masterpiece of its time. If you learned something or liked what you saw, then the best way to support me and my doings is by simply sharing this video around and maybe subscribing to the channel, as I'm all about older games and would very much love to get a group of like-minded people hanging about who also feel nostalgic love for these relics of our childhoods. Alas, that is it for today from my side. I wish you all the best and may you have a lovely rest of your day, whenever, wherever you are. Bye bye.